Hey folks, good evening. Going to interrupt all your chats. So there's going to be a couple of people trickling in because we're running a little bit late, but we've got 3 speakers, so we wanted to really get kicking along. I want to start by saying, thanks so much for coming out. It's been incredible to see some of the response that we have seen over last week and this week and what's planned for next. So, and of course, a huge thanks to the Carlton, Karen, and all the staff here who have donated this awesome venue, but also, their time and their advice to help us put this together. My name is Warren Connors. I'm an underwater robotics scientist at a lab called Defense Research Development Canada, which is in Dartmouth, just down the road. I'm also a recipient of 2 robotic surgeries that was done by a robot here at the QE2. And thanks to that, those robotic surgeries, I'm also a kidney cancer survivor. So I have the pleasure of being your host through A Pint of Robotics. The idea behind A Pint of Robotics was to put together kind of a casual talk series about some of the cool and innovative work that's going on right here in Halifax and Atlantic Canada in robotics. A lot of people don't naturally see this area as kind of a hotbed for robotic technology, but I hope by the end of it, through these talks, you'll have a bit of a different perspective. Our goal here isn't really to just wow you with math or blow you away with physics, but instead to give you a chance to grab a beer, sit with friends, and hear about some of the cool work that's going on here, delivered by the scientists and the engineers and the doctors who are doing this work every single day. So before we get too kicked up, though, I do actually have a bit of housekeeping to talk about. Pretty sure we've all heard of the first one. Unfortunately, there are still some COVID restrictions, so we need to be a little bit careful with it. So if you're getting up and you're moving around, please put a mask on. Other than that, sit down, enjoy yourself, should be fine. Of course, we're all having a beer, we're all having a bit of food, so you're probably wondering where the washrooms are. Just straight down to the end, hang a left, you'll see all the concert postings. It's right in, hang another left, and it's right there. Easy to find. You'll also note that there's some cameras set up around here. That's because we're also running a live stream, so there's some folks that couldn't make it for whatever reason. They're in other spots of the country, or just their schedule didn't allow. So they signed up to watch a live stream, which is on Facebook, on the QA2 Foundation's page. So you'll notice those. Really wasn't an issue before, but just be cognizant of the field of view of cameras if you don't mind.
Is it recorded? Can people watch at a different time?
I believe it's live streamed right now, but I'll check with you and see if it is actually recorded. So tonight's format. So the format of the events, the 3 events, is meant to be very casual. Obviously, we're sitting in a bar. Everybody's having some food and a drink. So we're not going to drive through like it's a conference, right? We'll start. I'm going to do a bit of an intro talk, which I'm doing right now. And then I want to talk a little bit about the QA2 Foundation and why I feel it's important and why we're here. And then we'll move into the talks. We'll start with Mae Seto's going to give a talk. It's about 20 to 25 minutes. We don't have a hard limit on that. I don't have a big hook. I'd love to have a big hook, but I don't have one. So we'll do that, and then we'll have a short break. Then we're going to go into the next talk, which will be at Gregson, and another short break, and then we'll go into the third talk, which will be Vincent Myers. And then at the end, we'll do a question period. So you might be wondering why we're not doing questions after each talk. The original plan when we put this together, for people who have actually followed this is our 3rd attempt at getting this on the road. COVID, every time we planned this, there was a COVID outbreak. So what we're going to do is we're using an application called Slido. And Slido is really just a website where you can submit questions. So everybody got an invitation that was from the QA2 Foundation the other day. That has a QR code, and it also has a link. If you go to that, you can just submit a question, right? And I highly encourage people to submit a question, because that question period at the end, where the 4 of us will be up here, is really where some of the interesting stuff comes out. It certainly did last week. So if something comes to mind, just follow that link, submit your question. It's anonymous, so don't worry about your question. And and we'll discuss it at the end of the night. And finally, fundraising, obviously I'd like to say I'm just up here singing for my supper, but, at the end of the day, this is a fundraising event. The QE2 Foundation does some incredible things, and one of the things that I was hoping to get from this, beyond just an awareness of what's going on in robotics and what's actually happening here in Halifax, is to raise funds for the robotics program at the QE2. So, you'll see QR codes and links that are on each of the tables, right? If you're enjoying the evening, then please, scan that code and donate what you can. Now, with that in mind, I want to take a couple of minutes and I want to talk about the QA2 Foundation, and I want to talk a little bit about how A Pint of Robotics really came about. So the QA2 Foundation is a charity that is wholly devoted to the QA2 Health Sciences Center. So for people who aren't from here or are new to here, the QA2 Health Sciences Center is really, it's the largest health sciences center on this coast, and it's really just a bunch of hospitals kind of jammed together under one umbrella. And because of that, they have a very broad scope, everything from neonatal care all the way to cancer treatments in the elderly, right? And that's a huge thing. And the foundation is there to help raise the quality of care of patients, right? And they do it in a bunch of different ways. It's not just buying the next X-ray machine. They're also, funding research. They're also funding education. They're funding process improvements. And all of that goes to sort of advance the care of regular Nova Scotians or regular Maritimers who come here to the QE2. So when I started putting this together, there was sort of a few numbers that kind of stood out, and I want to try and explain through these numbers. And this one to me is huge: 1 million patient visits, right? 1 million patient visits at the QE2. So there's 970,000 people in this province, and I'm sure that there's lots of people in this room that didn't have a patient visit at the QE2 this year, right? So you think about the number and you think about like the scope, but also the breadth of the care that's required, and it really starts to justify why it's important that the QE2 Foundation exists. This one, look, I'm a government scientist, so a number that big is just incomprehensible to me, right? But $250 million has been raised, and raised by just regular folks, like all the folks in here, right? 250 million, like $250 million. So if you think about that, it's a huge sum. Some of the money that's or some of the cool projects that have come up recently, a neat one is the hybrid OR. So this is really cool because it's building a very advanced operating room. It's one of the most advanced going. And it's mixing the capabilities to do things like diagnostic imaging as well as sort of laparoscopic or minimally invasive surgeries with open surgeries. And it's giving the surgical teams a lot of flexibility. And this is brand new, and it's one of the most advanced in the world right now, right? And critically, when it's giving the surgical teams a lot of flexibility, it's cutting down that time. It's giving the patient a lot more potential to get through those surgeries. So another one, and this is a big one for me, is some work that they did with the province to sort of refine cancer therapy treatments, right? And by looking at the process and developing a new cancer therapy prep lab, they were actually able to double the capacity for cancer patients, right? And anyone who's ever had cancer, one thing that happens when you find out is that a clock starts ticking, and it's always in your head. When's the next treatment? When's the next appointment? When's the next surgery, right? And you're always thinking about that. Cancer, people talk about the physical aspects of cancer. Cancer is also a bit of a mental challenge as well, right? Because it's always on your mind. So when you can double that capacity, you're shortening the wait times. That means more people are getting in and they're getting treated when they need to be treated, right? But it also eases that mental strain as well. So it was a huge thing. And then finally, surgical robotics. So this robot right here is called Da Vinci. And arguably, this robot knows me better than my wife Amy does. This robot's operated on me twice. There's one here. And it was Atlantic Canada's first robot-assisted surgery program that actually happened. And one thing to note with a system like this is, and with a lot of robotics, is that they're not replacing the surgeon, right? They're enhancing the surgeon's capabilities. So, and in a lot of robotics, that's exactly what you're seeing. You're not replacing the human, but you're enhancing the human's capability to do a job, right? And that's really what this is doing. And it's focused right now on gynecological, kidney, prostate, and ENT cancers, right? But there's a ton of potential with systems like this. And again, funded by donors. This wasn't a massive federal government program. It was funded by donors. So Mike Dunbar, who was here last week talking about a robot that does knee research, he made the quote, "There's no area of medicine that robotics has entered that it hasn't improved." As a person who works in the field, and all the people who will be speaking tonight would probably agree with me that there really isn't an area that robotics has entered that it hasn't improved the standard of living for humans in some way. And that's something I hope that really comes out of the talks. So this one's a real personal number, and the reason why the Pint of Robotics really came about, and that's more than 20,000 community members donate or come forward to support the QA2 Foundation in one way or another. And the reason why it's so personal to me is, well, to tell you this story, I got to kind of tell you about the worst day of my life, but it's a good story. It's a good story. A few years back, I was on top of the world. Everything was great. And we had just spent an evening at a friend's place, and we were heading home, and I was feeling a bit off. But, I was 42 years old. I was still indestructible. It was all good. So we went home. A little while later, I woke up, and I was in pain. And it wasn't the, I'm 42-year-old pain, because that happens. This was, I need to go to a hospital right now kind of pain. So we got up, and we went to the hospital, and showed up to QE2. And they were checking me out, and they said, oh, it's probably kidney stones. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that sucks, because I've heard about passing those, and it doesn't sound pleasant. But it wasn't a big deal, right? It was something that was very, easily treatable. And they sent me out for a CAT scan, and they come back, and the doctor that comes in, you could see on his face that something was different. And he said, well, you don't have kidney stones. I was like, great, okay, well. And he said, we found a large mass on your right kidney. And then we found a very large mass on your left kidney, and we're pretty sure they're cancer. So it's hard to explain how you react at that moment. Like, for me, somebody would probably say, oh, I was in shock, and I probably was. I stopped hearing what this guy was saying. My face was red. I just, all I could think about was that one word, and it stuck in my mind. And it was a really stressful thing. He talked about, I'm going to have to meet an oncologist and all this other stuff, and he left. And I remember sitting there with Amy, and a few minutes later, this other surgeon popped her head in, and she said, are you Warren Connors? I'm like, yeah. She said, my name is Dr. Kim. I represent a group here called the Urology Group that's between the QE2 and Dahazi. She said, I was over for a consult, and I saw your file. You're not going anywhere. We've got you. Stay here. And it was a funny thing, right? Because if you go to the hospital now, you'll see these posters. QE2 Foundation puts them up. And they say, we've got you, right? And to this day, I don't think Amy or I can see one of these without tearing up. Because you're so low, and then all of a sudden somebody comes along and it's like, no, we've got you. And so she came back a little while later, and she started telling me about the advanced capability that we have here in Halifax. And I got to admit, I was kind of blown away. I didn't really give it enough of a chance, I guess. But they were talking about advanced treatment options, and then it was a bit of a whirlwind, right? Like, they sent me off for CAT scans and biopsies and all this. I mean, I could glow in the dark by the end of the week. But at the end of it, I met this surgeon, Dr. Ricardo Rendon. He's going to speak next week. And he was telling me about a robotic capability they had. And he said, these tumors are bad, but because you're only in your early 40s, I don't want to take your kidneys out, right? So your quality of life matters. We have this robotic capability, and what we want to do is kind of take your kidneys apart and take the tumors out and then put them back together with whatever's left and get on with your life. It was so matter of fact in a sense. It was weird. But that's exactly what they did, right? So I went in for this surgery, met the robot, Da Vinci, I just showed you a minute ago. Looks a lot less sinister when it's shut off, by the way. It's all folded up. And I had my first surgery. And at the time, they took out 2/3 of one of my kidneys. So they opened it up, took it all apart, and then put it back together. And it worked. It was crazy. So I woke up a few hours later, and what was ridiculous about it was I had looked on the internet about some of these kidney cancer surgeries. And you see the person with the scar that starts here and ends here, and it was scary. I woke up, and a few hours later, they were like, okay, time to get up, Warren. You got to walk around. And I was like, you guys kidding? But that's exactly what happened. And I was able to walk, and I was able to move. And 2 days later, I went home, right? And you think about the complexity of that surgery and the fact that I was able to go home 2 days later. It was insane, right? So because of that, I was able to heal really, really quickly. And 5 weeks later, they sent me off for my second one, and I had that one done. And in that case, they only had to take 1/3 of my kidney. So if you're doing the math, I have a whole kidney. It's just distributed. And I, again, was able to heal up really quickly, and I went back to work 2 weeks later, okay? And this is why I wanted to tell this story, is how crazy it was to go from the worst day of your life to back to work like nothing happened in 10 weeks, right? Because of that capability. Now, why that matters is at the end of that week, I think it was the end of that week, they sent us home because of COVID. okay? So everybody knows what happened when COVID happened, right? Everything stopped. Everything stopped. At the hospitals, everything. And I mentioned that ticking clock earlier. If I hadn't had that surgery, or if I hadn't been able to heal up quickly enough to get that second surgery, then I don't know what would have happened. I don't know how long I would have had to wait. I don't know what would have happened with the cancer I had, right? Because that's the fear. Where's it going, right? So that was huge to me. And when they sent me home and I was thinking about it, and Amy and I wanted to do something, we realized that this entire program was funded by people like you and me. People who didn't know me. People who, you know, like I may never run into on the street. But it was so humbling that they reached into their pocket and helped out. And going forward, you know, it meant that I really wanted to do something to give back. And that's really what started this. On top of that, I was telling some colleagues about this, and they were like, really? We have that capability here in Halifax. And they didn't understand that. And then I was telling my surgeon what we did, and he's like, really? You guys do that here in Halifax? I thought, this is it. This was the genesis of A Pint of Robotics. Why not get people together and give these talks, and at the same time try and give back to the QA2 Foundation that did so much for us by, you know, raising my quality of life. Obviously, I still have 2 kidneys. As you may notice, I'm not exactly on some crazy diet. But also possibly saved my life. Because if I hadn't have gotten that surgery, I don't know what would have happened. So the whole point, as I said, of the Pint of Robotics really is that beyond medicine, we have extensive capabilities in advanced sensing and robotics. And that's really what I'm hoping we can highlight, you know, to raise some awareness on that and just have a relaxed chance to hear some cool stories and have a beer. The speakers are coming from medicine, they're coming from academia, they're coming from industry, and of course government as well. And they're all doing advanced robotics in this area. So tonight we're going to talk with Dr. Mae Seto. And she has the chair, the Irving Shipbuilding Research Chair in Marine Engineering and Autonomous Systems. They could have given you a shorter name than that, Mae. Maritime Robotics Research at Dell. And then one of her PhD students, Ed Gregson's, going to give a talk on fault-tolerant autonomy for space debris removal. So when he described it to me, he was sort of like, you know, dump truck or garbage truck in space. So that sounds really cool. And then the third talk is going to be Dr. Vincent Myers, he's from DRDC as well, the lab I'm from, and he's going to chat about robotics and the search for Franklin's lost ships. So people who are interested in the Northwest Passage and some of the lore around that, he'll give a bit of a talk. So as I said, you know, questions are what makes this evening interesting, I found. So, you know, scan the code, submit a question if you have it. It's free. No, it's anonymous, and it's easy to ask those questions. And if there's something I can't answer or any of the speakers can't answer, then you can reach out to the QA2 Foundation. They can reach out to me, and we can get you an answer. And then, like I said, you know, if you're enjoying the evening, please, you know, think about that. Donate now. It's important, and you don't know whose life it's actually going to change. So we're going to take 5 minutes and set up for the first speaker. And thanks so much for listening, folks.
Confession to make. I'm your fool. Everyone's got the chains to break, holding you. Will you bother resist? Don't be abused. Is someone getting the best, the best, the best, the best of you? Is someone getting
go ahead. Hey, folks. So, because we have 3 speakers tonight, we're going to kick it up a little bit quicker than we did last week. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mae Seto. Mae was born in Vancouver, BC. She did an undergrad in the electrical engineering option, Eng Physics, and her PhD in mechanical engineering, both at UBC, University of British Columbia. She tenured her NSERC industrial postdoc fellowship at ISC Research, again in Vancouver, one of the top developers of marine robots. Mae joined DRDC, Defense R&D Canada, as a defense scientist in 2000. Her areas of expertise are autonomy and control of robots, marine robotics, underwater nav and communications, and underwater acoustics. In 2017, Mae joined Dal's Faculty of Engineering as an associate prof and the director of the Intelligent Systems Laboratory. She is also the Irving Shipbuilding Research Chair in Marine Engineering and Autonomous Systems. Your business card must be this long. Mae is still a proud Canucks fan. Don't hold that against her, though. And has volunteered for years with the Scouts and Guides. So please, folks, welcome Dr. Mae Seto. Thanks, Mae.
So I wanted to thank Warren for the opportunity to present at this event. Because my husband is a cancer survivor. His cancer had moved along further than Warren's, had metastasized. And he was also a successful cancer survivor. So that's a testament to the capabilities that we have in the Maritimes to address this horrible problem, which is not going away. Right. So I will add my voice to Warren's to, if you understand the pain and the havoc of the streets in people's lives, please give generously. Anyways, this is the presentation, Marine Robotics and Research at Dalhousie University. And my objective here is not so much to say this is what we're doing at Dal. So the problems I'm going to talk about today are deliberately picked to not be led by Dal. This is our contribution to other people's problems, other people's research, right? And the intent is to highlight this is the type of research and the type of capabilities and interests that we have in the Maritimes. Okay, and as far as our lab is concerned, so I'm with the Intelligent Systems Lab, so most of them are down that end of the pub, and they're probably going to be the noisiest. It's all right, I'm used to being embarrassed. So. Right, so our goal with the Intelligent Systems Lab is to work on robotic autonomy. So the autonomy is the smarts, the intelligence, the brains that you put on the robot. And prior to about 10 years ago-ish, a lot of robots did not have those smarts. They did exactly what they were told. And if they ran into something that they were not familiar with, or if there was not a scripted answer for it, then it wouldn't know what to do. So with the autonomy, the smarts that we put onto the robot, you give the robot the ability to make decisions, to be able to action its decisions, and then check on whether the decisions were good, did this solve the problem, and if not, adapt as necessary. So that is a transformational change in what happened in robotics, to be able to put that capability onto the robot. So we put the autonomous systems out there, and we need them to have lots of capabilities if we're putting them into harsh environments. So the marine environment is extremely harsh. It's difficult to sense, to communicate, just about anything. There aren't many environments worse than marine on Earth. Right, so it's a good idea. Let's put the autonomy on the robot. Why would we not do that? Well, it's always been a good idea. What are the enablers that made that possible? So one of the enablers is high-powered embedded processors that are at the same time not power hungry. We have sensors now that are designed to be functioning on embedded systems. So we're not taking this gigantic system that sits on a lab bench and trying to crunch it into a smaller volume to stick it into an embedded system. So the sensors are now purpose-made for embedded systems. Their powering is purpose-made for embedded systems. Right, so that's another enabler. And then at the same time, things like the advanced batteries that we have with the very high energy densities made it possible to have embedded systems that could go out and do lots of things for an extended time. So it's cute to have a toy, but I want something that works in a harsh environment and can do a lot more number crunching on board. So it should do something with the brains that it has. In order to do something, you need to have energy. So high energy density. All of those things converged about a decade ago, and it made the possibility of intelligent systems possible. Right, so just to diverge for a second, the phrase artificial intelligence is referring to a lot of things. It's used everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and sometimes it's even inaccurately used. But for us, it includes tools that we use like machine vision, machine learning, and robotics. So robotics, sometimes referred to as cyber-physical systems, is part of that spectrum of artificial intelligent capability. So everybody's familiar with all robots have sensors that sense themselves and they sense their interaction with the environment. All robots have actuators so that they can go do things. They can roll around, they can move around, they can push things. What I'm going to talk about today is the brains, so the cognitive deliberation, the brain that's on the robot. So that's the difference that's happened in the last little while. So until recently, again, the robots did mostly scripted missions. And then when intelligent systems with all this convergence came by, we had intelligent systems. Right? So why do we need this? We need this because if we're in harsh environments to do our missions, the environment will change. So the underwater environment is very unstructured, very harsh, difficult to predict, not amenable to predictions is the way we usually say. The robot itself can change. So if you deploy your robot to run for 7 to 10 days, it will change, it will evolve. And the robot has to adapt to that. So if nothing else, things will break. How will you deal with that? And then the mission can change, right? The mission will change because maybe the environment has changed. So if the weather kicks up and the robot can't do the mission in the way that it has to figure out another way to carry out its mission. Right, so we need those intelligent system capabilities. And what I have down here on the left is a laundry list of the capabilities that are needed by the robot to perform a complex mission in an unstructured environment. So those are the same capabilities you would ask of an operator to perform those same duties. So we're trying to take what was in a human operator and put that into the robot. Right, so the advantages of putting the autonomy onto the marine robot, you can make it scalable. So if you decide you're going to sense a larger environment, in principle, you can add more robots to the mix. That creates its own complexity too when you've got lots of them out there, but in principle, you can do that. At the same time, you can adaptively sample in space and in time to capture whatever your phenomena is. So whether you're trying to capture a weather system, a harmful algal bloom, or an underwater hydrothermal vent, you can do that. The robots, as you know, advantageously, they are easy to move from place to place. People have taken robots to all corners of the earth. And they can access places that people cannot. So if your interest is to extensively map the deepest part of the ocean, we're going to be sending robots. Right? That's not a place that's accessible for humans. And then the persistence. The persistence is really important. The persistence means I can stay out there and work for a very long time. So I'll give you an example with the unmanned underwater vehicles that were initially deployed in the Persian Gulf to look for underwater mines, so mines that are there to target ships and submarines deliberately. Prior to these unmanned underwater vehicles showing up, you would send flesh and blood divers to go and do that job. Right, so when the first unmanned underwater vehicles were deployed to do this, there was a study done, and it looks like the multiplication factor of a robot in that particular situation was, equal to 15 divers. So with one robot, you could do the work of 15 divers, which speaks to the persistence of what the robot can do, right, and to its multiplication factor. Right, so those are all good justifications for making your marine robots smart. I'm going to go through the 3 different domains. So marine is not just the wet stuff, and it's not just the stuff on the surface. It's also the volume of space that's above the water. So if you speak to the oceanographers, they'll tell you that it goes from whatever, the trench all the way out to, I don't know, not quite the International Space Station, but enough that you have to be concerned with the atmosphere. So the first marine robot we're going to look at will be the aerial ones, then I'll look at the surface ones, and then the underwater ones. So we're going to go drill down. Right, so the aerial ones, they resemble their crewed counterparts. They can be fixed wings, they could be multi-rotors. They can take speeds from to hovering, like you have with the quad rotors, to 40 knots. So the Ariane that we work with can go 40 knots. Right, and they go by multiple names. So the unmanned aerial vehicles, sometimes they're referred to as unmanned aerial systems. They're more or less the same thing. So the first project I'm going to talk about is for autonomous landing of quadrotors on a ship that's in a sea state. So you've got a ship that's bouncing around, and you've got a quadrotor coming in. How do we land this quadrotor so it's not in pieces on the deck? Right, so the way that it's done more or less now is you could fly this into a net. So that's a type of crash landing, or you can do what we call the catch and kill. So with the Ariane, you would have two operators. One operator would put on their big heavy gloves, and when the quadrotor comes within range, you would catch it. And then the second operator, upon seeing that, would kill the quadrotor, which means to cut the power or to cut the rotors at least. Right, so catch and kill nets, you can land onto airbags. Those are the techniques that have been used. So my graduate student, Jordan Ross, at the time, was looking at this problem, and what they ended up doing was we modeled the ship using a model, the response amplitude operators. You don't have to get too into that, but there's a way of describing the ship's response in a different sea state at different aspects. And you can reproduce that on something called a Stewart platform. And the main strategy is that the aerial vehicle should have some visibility into what the ship motions are. And then between the two of them, they can plan when to land, when to touch down. Right? And with what is now Dr. Ross's algorithm, they can find windows of opportunity based on what the sea state excitation is doing to the ship. Because you're not going to be able to predict what the seas are doing. You're going to have to deal with it as when you're on top of it. So that's one project that Irving had sponsored. So that's our sponsor. Another project is to look at using unmanned aerial vehicles as scouts for ships. So if you're in the Arctic, you can use radar and you can look to the horizon and say, okay, there's no ice there, I'm going at that heading. That may be the case, but as you go over the horizon, there may be ice that you perhaps don't want to encounter. And with a lot of ships, what they're looking for is some idea of how to get leads. So leads in the ice are openings that are wider than the turn diameter of the ship. If the ship goes down a lead that is not wider than the turn diameter, then the ship is trapped. Right? It's going to have to back out, which ships are not happy doing. Right? So you can deploy an unmanned aerial vehicle. So at a modest altitude of 100 meters, you've got 30-something kilometers of horizon. So that's 5 or 6 horizons. Right? So your visibility is a lot greater, and you can better predict what the ship should be, where the ship should be going. So this is Dr. Deeb's PhD project, and Dr. Deeb also looked at how to track ice that's moving. So we're used to tracking things that are not moving. That's easy, right? They're not moving. We can find them, and we come back later and we'll find them again. Right? So she's developed a method to track the ice that's moving. And the ice is not just moving. The ice is also changing its appearance as time goes on. Right? So these are the type of capabilities that we're doing. Irving paid for that as well. This was a problem that they were interested in with ships going up north. With this problem, we were looking at using unmanned aerial vehicles with a tethered payload. And this was inspired by the aquaculture industry that we have here. So if you're not familiar with it, we have actually a pretty good aquaculture industry. So the task there is to collect water over this very large area to do tests. So what are we looking for? We're looking for coliform, we're looking for nitrite, we're looking for nutrients, and then in what density. And at the same time, you could also look for something called eDNA. I only learned about this a year ago, and this is really neat. If you have fish in the water, they're shedding DNA. I guess we all do, right? We're all shedding DNA. And if you can find the DNA in the water, then you know that the fish are there without having to actually physically see a fish. Right? If you're going to deploy a robot, does the fish want to come close to you? Probably not. Right? So this is adaptive sampling of water from a tethered payload with an unmanned aerial vehicle over a large area. Otherwise, what you are doing is you're putting an operator and a boat, two operators and a boat into the water to go around to do the infinitely interesting task of getting water. Right? So we can do it this way, and it's a lot faster and a little more efficient. So this would be deployed on a working class unmanned aerial vehicle eventually. So Cesar Rodriguez is the lead for that project. He's at the point where we're trying to find a controller that will stabilize the tethered payload when it's being excited. So if you're going to run around with a pendulum, it's going to be excited a lot, right? So we have to figure out how you move, how you operate with that. And then once that's figured out, then put it onto the actual vehicle and then test drive it, right? So this was sponsored by a local OEM for unmanned aerial vehicles. So the surface marine robots, they go by different names: unmanned surface vehicle, autonomous surface vehicle. So unmanned is anything that doesn't, or uncrewed, doesn't have a little person in there, right? So autonomous implies usually more, that it has more brains, right? So when we refer to things, sometimes we'll call them autonomous as opposed to unmanned, because an unmanned vehicle could also be a tethered vehicle, right? And they pretty much resemble their full crewed counterparts. So planing craft, very fast, high speed, catamaran hull forms, so low speed stability and maneuverability, and then the semi-submersibles. So I've worked with all three of them, and I understand the merits of all three. As these are above water vehicles, they could have air breathing engines on them, and if they have air breathing engines on them, then you're capable of speeds like 40 knots, 20 meters per second for a very long time. Right, so an example of an application of an unmanned surface vehicle is for surveys in lakes. So this is a project that we're doing with an academic partner actually, who's going to be sponsored by a commercial client who doesn't want to be identified just yet. So what is the problem? The problem is the Atlantic whitefish. The Atlantic whitefish is on the brink of extinction and is one of the most endangered species in Canada. So they're generally indigenous to Nova Scotia. And in the 1920s, the Tusket River is where there was a huge, large habitat that sustained them. So these fish would spawn in fresh water, and then they would instinctively seek salt water. Right, so in the 1920s, they built a dam which inadvertently blocked their access to the salt water. To some extent, that's okay. Androgynous means that it can live out its life in fresh water and fight its instinct to constantly look for salt water. So that was one hit against the Atlantic whitefish. The second hit is the invasive species. Right? So the invasive species are bass and pickerel. So they would come in and kind of eat up the food in your area or scare you away or whatever it is fish do to marginalize other fish. Right? And the third hit was the acidification of the water. So that's pushed the Atlantic whitefish right to the edge. And we've got over 100 of these being reared actually in the Dalhousie Aquatron tank, so big giant tub of water. And we're trying to figure out where to release them. Right? You don't want to release them into lakes where they're going to be, you know, you've got invasive species that'll marginalize their existence, or the inability to find salt water. So the problem that was put to us is there's a whole bunch of candidate lakes with access to salt water. So freshwater lakes that somehow become salt water as they get closer to the surrounding ocean waters. We need to survey those lakes, and we need an asset that 2 or 3 people can carry and deploy down at the shore. And this thing goes off, collects the water, does the tests, and comes back with an assessment of this is the profile of this lake. And then the scientists, the biologists, would make the decision on whether it was adequate or not to transplant the Atlantic whitefish to. Right, so that's the gist of that problem. These things don't live in very deep water. 30 meters deep is about the deepest. They're in waters. They prefer waters that are a little cooler, right? And they follow the nutrient cycle as it goes through the day. And I'm not a biologist. I don't know all the ins and outs of that. But that's a potential application. Well, we're working on it now. That is an application of an unmanned surface vehicle. This one is kind of interesting. This is with a local company, Leeway Marine. So for all of these projects, we are not the prime. We are helping them with it, right? And this is why I'm showcasing their projects. It's a demonstration of what the Maritimes is interested in. So this is an unmanned surface vehicle. or a robotic boat, if you like, right? And and what we were contracted to look at was what is the suitability of this platform to recover things that are on the surface of the water. So as an example of something on the surface of the water, you can have an unmanned, autonomous underwater vehicle. Right, so once it comes to this, it's easy to just turf things over the side of the rails, right? It's more challenging to bring them back onto the ship. And this might potentially do away with the possibility of having to recover it completely. So we would put a robotic arm on over the side of the boat and have it either thread a lift lug, or at least track that point so that we know what it's doing. Right, so our role in this was to do the modeling to see how possible that is. So given the size of a candidate unmanned surface vehicle and a robot, what are the possibilities? Right, so we had to study how this robot behaves in a sea state. Right, so if it rocks and rolls too much, then we can't do it, right? Because you're never going to be able to catch or to grasp something else over the side. And keeping in mind that they're both in the same sea state, but they both respond very differently to the sea state, because one thing is really, really small and the other thing is super big. So this is our candidate unmanned surface vehicle. This is the autonomous underwater vehicle that has come to the surface. Right, so we were looking at this in beam C. So tracking the AUV means it is station keeping to one point on the AUV, even though these two are both moving in a different way, right? The inertia is different, the control is different, and their response to the sea state is different. Right, so this is the worst condition possible, and we would never recover it in beam Cs, right? You would always head into the seas to recover something that's on the surface. So anything that's got a lift lug or that needs, if you need a needle to be threaded and you're both bobbing around on the seaway, you can do this. So once it's learned what it's doing, then it'll start tracking the AUV, and we consider that at this point recovered. Right, so again, the idea is to have this vehicle, which is robotic, go out and do the recoveries. Another problem we're looking at is the North Atlantic right whale going up and down the eastern seaboard. So here's us-ish. I think that's us. Yeah, that's us. Right. So these whales, as part of their activities for daily living, they'll go from as far north as here for their feeding, their breeding, and then they'll go south as far as Florida or Georgia for their calving. Right. So that's fine. That's their activities of daily living over the course of the year. They go up and down the eastern seaboard. The problem is there's also a lot of shipping traffic, and the risk for whale strikes is very high. And you guessed it, the North Atlantic right whale is another endangered species. So the hypothesis that we're working with, and this is with a local company, Jasco, and Marina's the lead on that. The hypothesis is that, so first you can't go pinging on whales. It's just not something we do in Canada, I'm told, right? So can we detect these things passively? So using passive acoustics, and based on the fact they emit too, right? They have a variety of different whale calls. So in principle, you should be able to. So these things are also emitting at very low frequencies, so 400 hertz, right? So if the whale is emitting at 400 hertz in one direction, can we pick this up passively? So meaning by listening to detect and localize the whale. And the ask that was made was to detect and localize to within about 2 horizons. So 10 to 12 kilometers away, the ships would like to know that there is a whale out there. Right, and our role in this at the moment is to investigate that. So you would model the whale as a source, as an underwater acoustic source, and then you could run around with your robots in simulation space with receivers and see, is it possible? And we would try to faithfully capture the underwater environment that it's in based on measures like its bathymetry, the temperature, the conductivity, the sound velocity profile. Right, so in principle, is this possible? So that's the early stages of a research project. Right, so that's another project that was done with a local company. I'm going to now go to the underwater vehicles. So there's quite an assortment of these, and they generally don't go very fast. So 2-3 meters per second for an unmanned underwater vehicle is blistering fast. Right? And they have all sorts of challenges in terms of communications and sensing because of the harsh underwater environment. Right? So it depends on what your requirement is, which one you would choose. Some can hover, fly by like an aircraft. This one's sawtooth profiles, and this one, the surfboard skims the surface, and the payload sensors are down at depth at some standoff from the surfboard. Right. So one project we looked at, and we're still looking at this actually, is to try and track by actively pinging on a target. Right. So long baseline localization does this. So long baseline transponders are usually moored to the seabed, and as something comes flying through, it'll try and localize it for as long as it can before it gets out of range. So we wanted to see the advantage that was conferred by making your long baseline transponders move around. Right? If you put them onto the AUVs, what is the percentage? What is the gain that you would get in being able to track a target that's moving through? Right? And this is having the 3 AUVs collaborate and sense together on a common target. Right, so that's something that we're working on with Thales. And as part of the same project, we're also looking at underwater communications. So how do we get them to communicate so that they can work together? Right, so we've said the environment is quite compromised for communications and sensing. What can you do? So there's actually 3 AUVs and a target flying through. This is Bedford Basin, and these guys go like maybe 2 meters per second. So it doesn't look like they're moving, but they are. So for one color, they're transmitting. For yet another color, they are receiving. Right, so we are testing this in the using the actual communication devices. So they're called software-defined modems, but you can think of them as types of underwater radios. Right, so they can. So that's one way to investigate it. And once we come up with the algorithm, and it looks like it works, we put it onto the autonomous vehicles and try it. Right, so it's kind of neat that you can test directly with the communication and sensing device. So it gives you a higher form of studying it. You're now emulating it, not so much simulating it. This was a fun project. So Jordan and I worked on this one as well. So we're looking at the scenario of these underwater vehicles towing arrays. So arrays are sensors that are streamed out behind in a line, and normally you would tow them from a ship. So if you tow them from the ship and we're done towing for the day, then you would recover them on a ship. Now you can, in principle, based on powering and maneuvering and even some of the autonomy, you can tow them from an autonomous underwater vehicle. So that's kind of in itself still a fairly emerging idea. So if you're going to tow it from an autonomous underwater vehicle, you will have to stop at some point, right? Because the AUV will run out of power and it'll need to download its data and all that. So in that instance, we can't stop this. We can't stop the AUV. You can stop the boat and bring in the array, but you can't stop the AUV. If you do, the array will go to the seabed or it'll come to the surface. And neither is a good place for the array, because that's a good, you risk a lot of damage. So the idea that was proposed was that we could have a dock that is mobile, and that this thing would dock to it, and it will continue to be underway with the array, and at the same time it can charge its batteries and download its data. And the way it's drawn here, an unmanned surface vehicle could be the one that is pulling the dock through the water. So the intent for this was persistent surveillance in the Arctic. So if we wanted to be measuring things in the water in the Arctic all the time, we don't want to send somebody up 15, 20,000 a pop just to get people back and forth, just to recharge the batteries and to download the data. So can we come up with a robotic solution for this, right? And the company that was doing this, ISE, is represented on the East Coast. So within 18 months, we went from a concept to a mobile dock that was built. Right? So the mobile dock is being towed by not a robot, at least not yet, but it's still a mobile dock. So underwater, so this all looks very lit and bright, and you should be able to see the dock, but once you get down 15, 20 feet, you don't have much light. And at the depths you may tow these arrays, you're going to get no light. So the solution, and I had a part in this as well, was to have the mobile dock be outlined with very powerful underwater LEDs. And we could look at the pattern of the LEDs, and based on how you perceive them, you can get some idea of how the AUV's position is relative to that mobile dock. Right? So if you think of a circle, and you put all these lights in a circle, and you look at it head on, you'll see a circle. But if you look at it at any other angle, you're really seeing an ellipse at some angle and some inclination, right? And the algorithm for taking the perceived light geometry and determining the position, the relative position between the AUV and that dock, is something called Endpoint Perspective. We don't need to go into details on that, right? So that was what was tried, and we trained it using a machine learning algorithm on the dock, right? And it worked, actually. It worked very well. So the extra bit that the machine learning algorithm can add is more effective when the dock and the AUV are at more extreme angles. Usually when the AUV is coming in to the dock, it's at a constant heading, constant speed, and it sees the dock more or less in front of it. But if it was coming in from some other angle, then the machine learning algorithm does a better job of predicting, you need to go down some distance and point up or something. Right, so this was really neat, and so with the in-water trials, it docked repeatedly without fail, right? And that's, as an engineer, I find that really unusual to begin with. But things do without fail. And then the last project I'm going to talk about is something we're doing with a government partner. So Warren and Vince are from DRDC, and I was at DRDC. And this is to develop the smarts on an autonomous underwater vehicle. So it can go looking for static objects on the bottom of the seabed, so mines. Right, so this is a simulation from our hardware in the loop. So the AUV can see things using its special acoustic sensors and identify them, and we want the AUV to be able to act on what it sees. Right, so if it sees an object that looks like something that we are interested in, they can come back and view it from another direction and maybe a different altitude. Right? We also wanted the robot to have self-preserving behaviors. So, for example, it should avoid obstacles. It should avoid the seabed. It should stay within the block of space that it's told to work in, because if not, and if you're navigating using dead reckoning, then you risk losing it, right? So if you're dead reckoning, it gets worse and worse with time. We want to be able to plan missions that optimize for the objects that we are looking for, and the multiple tasks that a robot has to do. It's not just drive through the water or get your pictures. There's a lot of other tasks behind the scenes to maintain the robot and to do the mission. So how would we do the scheduling for that? So that's a type of autonomy that's useful as well. And then the fault tolerance. Right? So how can we predict when a fault may occur, or we see a fault brewing, or a fault has occurred and it wasn't predicted because something broke? Right? So these are all capabilities that we're interested in to make the marine robot smarter. Right? So that again is with our with one of our government partners. So that's my presentation. What I wanted to highlight was that there is a lot of expertise in the Maritimes in marine robotics, and we've only got a piece of everybody else's problems, but There's quite a few people and a lot of expertise here. Right, so that is my presentation. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, folks, thanks so much, Mae. We're going to take a very short break, and we'll get set up for Ed Gregson, and then we'll kick on from there. Thanks, folks.
We are set up for Ed Gregson.
You got his...
Like what right up off the street, you and I should meet. Jukebox skipping like a stone. Headlights pointed at the dawn. We were sure we'd never see an end to it all. To shake things in the blues, and we don't know just where our boats will
All right, make sure John's ready. Okay, folks. Sorry for the short break, but with 3 talks tonight, we want to keep it moving if we can. So I'm going to introduce Mr. Ed Gregson. Ed Gregson's a Halifax boy. He grew up here and attended Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, graduating in 2012 with a degree in Eng Physics. He returned and worked as a mechanical engineer in a local medical device startup. I'm curious how that went. And as an analyst in a geriatric medicine research lab before attending Dalhousie as a mechanical engineering grad student to pursue an interest in robotics. As a PhD candidate in the Intelligent Systems Lab, his research interests include autonomy, machine learning, and space systems, and his thesis concerns the use of robotic spacecraft to remove and dispose of space debris. So, folks, please join me in welcoming Ed Gregson.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Ed Gregson, and my PhD project is garbage, specifically space garbage, and specifically fault-tolerant autonomy for space debris. Can I point this at this? Oh, it does work. Okay, so first off, I'll give an overview of sort of space debris and just how it presents a problem. I'll talk about the mitigation measures people are trying to use to deal with it. I'll talk about what sort of actions have been taken to date towards removing space debris, and then I'll talk about how it ties in with my research. So, space debris. So, space debris consists of sort of dead satellites, rocket bodies, and sort of pieces that have broken off of dead satellites and rocket bodies that are all sort of orbiting the Earth. And it's built up from all the objects that we've launched since the start of the space age, because once you get to a high enough altitude, the drag from the atmosphere is low enough that things stay up there for a long time. So collisions with space debris can damage or destroy active satellites, so it does present a threat. And from this GIF from the ESA, you can see sort of a visualization of how much space debris there is orbiting the Earth. So you can see a bunch of it orbiting really close around the Earth in sort of low Earth orbit, and then some sort of in the geostationary orbit, sort of this big ring around it. So it's becoming a danger, particularly in sort of heavily used orbits like low Earth orbit, which are sort of the circular orbits about sort of 500 to 1,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. And space debris moves at orbital velocities, so it's sort of in the kind of around 10 kilometers a second. So roughly 10 times the speed of a bullet, so a small piece can hit like a grenade, which you can see in this sort of little visualization we've got here. Can blow things right apart. So here's an example of a space debris hit on the space shuttle. I'm not sure if this is a window or one of the external tiles, but you can see it sort of made this big sort of break in it here. Now, this might look like what you'd get if you chucked a ball bearing at a window, but this was probably made by something the size of like a fleck of paint, maybe, a speck of dust. It just hits that hard. So if you actually threw something that, if it actually got hit by a piece of space debris the size of a ball bearing, something more like this would happen. So you see this is sort of a solid piece of aluminum, and it's blown this big crater in it here, kind of melted it all up, and it's actually transmitted the shock wave through to the other side and caused it to start to sort of bow out like this and separate. And this ball bearing here, they just put in there for scale. The real one is basically, vaporized, coated the inside of the crater here. So when space debris hits, the one big problem is that when space debris hits active spacecraft or other debris, it can actually break those things apart and turn it into more debris. So it forms new debris, and the debris population grows. So this can cause, this sort of positive feedback reaction can cause sort of an exponential rise in the amount of space debris orbiting the Earth, which is called the Kessler syndrome. And if the Kessler syndrome proceeds for long enough, then effectively some really useful orbits that we use for communication satellites and observing the Earth become basically unusable. So here you can see sort of a plot of how the space debris population has increased over time. So these red bars are just the active spacecraft, the stuff that's actually supposed to be up here, and everything else is basically sort of trash that's been building up. So the debris is tracked from the ground using radar and telescopes. So the US Air Force is mostly the one who tracks space debris, and currently they're tracking over 17,000 pieces. I think that figure is from 2014, so it's probably much larger now. And they have a size limit on what they can track. If it's too small, they can't track it. I think if it's below 10 centimeters or so, they can't track it. So there's probably much more than that, but these are just sort of the big pieces. So they do what are called conjunction assessments. Basically, they look at their entire catalog of tracked debris and sort of predict where it's going to be in the future. And if they predict a collision with an active satellite, then they'll send what's called a sort of a conjunction warning to the satellite operator, who then has to sort of command their satellite to fire its thrusters, change its orbit slightly to perform an avoidance maneuver so that it won't hit. Now, despite that, it's predicted that at least 5 large debris objects will need to be removed from orbit to prevent a continuing Kessler syndrome and a continuing loss of sort of usable orbits. So, now I'll talk about the mitigation measures people have been using. So basically, mitigation measures have been split between what people are currently doing, which are sort of best practices for satellite operators, and active debris removal, where they actually go up and remove debris, which hasn't been done yet, but is being proposed for the near future. So this picture on the side here is a picture of EnviSat, and that's a really big European Earth observation satellite in low Earth orbit. It's about the size of a school bus, and it died in 2012. They lost contact with it. It's unresponsive, so it's basically tumbling up there. And they're really worried about it because it's in a very busy orbit, and if anything hits it, it could be a massive source of new space debris. Single collisions between objects can, meaningfully, significantly change that sort of graph you saw earlier of the space debris population. So this is sort of a prime target for removal. So for best practices, basically, you make your satellites large enough to be trackable, so that the US Space Force and stuff can track it from the ground and do conjunction predictions. There was actually a company that was trying to launch low Earth orbit observation satellites and did not get permission because their CubeSats weren't big enough. And they launched them anyway, and they've got a massive, big, I think, $1 million fine against them for doing that. So another best practice is to have sort of onboard thrusters and fuel reserves so that the satellite can perform avoidance maneuvers if a collision is predicted. And then finally, there's something called the 25-year rule, which is basically that you should plan for your satellite to deorbit within 25 years of end of life. So maybe you actively deorbit it, or maybe it sort of passively deorbits, but it should come down within 25 years of dying, essentially, of becoming unresponsive. So this here is a picture of RadarSat-1, which is a Canadian synthetic aperture Earth observation radar satellite. And it's sort of the kind of thing that I think it's still up there orbiting, but we would want to bring it down ideally if we could. So a satellite can be, for the 25-year rule for bringing your satellite down at the end of life, there's a variety of means you can use to do that. So you can just fire your thrusters, slow yourself down, and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. But there's also passive means. So one of these passive means is called a drag sail. Basically, it releases a big sort of balloon or kind of fabric sail, which effectively increases its drag. So if the satellite is in a low enough orbit that there's still sort of some meaningful trace of atmosphere around, that can increase its drag significantly and really speed up the time in which it re-enters the atmosphere. Another possibility is electrodynamic tethers, which is basically you sort of have a big tether electrically conductive tether coming out of your satellite, and it interacts with the Earth's magnetic field and can produce a force to slow you down. So there's a company called Tethers Unlimited that basically makes this sort of electrodynamic tether tape that your satellite can release at the end of life, and that will deorbit it. So these are good because they're sort of passive means. Even if your satellite dies, they'll still work and bring it down. So now we'll move on to active debris removal, which hasn't been done yet, but which has been proposed and is sort of what I mainly think about. So debris removal will be required to prevent an ongoing Kessler cascade. No active debris removal missions have yet been conducted, but multiple methods have been proposed. So there's ground-based methods, and that's something like a laser broom, where they basically use a big laser on Earth to kind of fire at the piece of debris and sort of ablate a jet of gas out of one side of it so that it deorbits and re-enters the atmosphere. But there's also space-based methods, where you sort of send a spacecraft up to retrieve it, like you see in this picture. So my sort of thesis mainly concerns sort of space-based methods, which have been kind of the main methods people have been talking about. So in the space-based methods, you would send a retrieval spacecraft up to approach the debris and sort of apply a force on it to get it to slow down and re-enter. And the main difference between all the various sort of schemes that have been proposed for this is the means of applying the force. So non-contact means are something like an ion beam shepherd. So in an ion beam shepherd spacecraft, basically you'd have your piece of debris like this, and then you'd have your retrieval spacecraft sort of fly up in front of it, and it's pushed along by something called an ion engine, which is sort of like a very efficient low-thrust electric rocket. And has two of them, one pointing forward and one pointing back. And it turns them both on so that it can just sort of hold steady in front of this piece of debris. But the jet it's squirting out from the back sort of hits the piece of debris and causes drag and essentially slows it down very gradually so that it re-enters the atmosphere much faster. But more commonly proposed are sort of contact methods. So the more sort of popular method suggested by far is to send up a spacecraft with a robotic arm to grab onto the satellite, sort of detumble it, sort of prevent it from sort of randomly tumbling and secure it, and then fire its rockets to sort of cause it to re-enter the atmosphere. So here we see a proposed ESA proposed mission where they send a robotic spacecraft with a robotic arm up to grab Envisat, which we talked about earlier, sort of stop it from tumbling, get it under control, and sort of deorbit it. There's also been suggestions to do the same thing, except instead of using a robot arm, use things like nets and harpoons. So this is an ESA graphic showing a debris removal spacecraft. Oh, I got the pointer. Here, shooting out a net and sort of enveloping this piece of debris, and then it'll fire its rockets to kind of tug it and change its velocity. And there's a similar idea where instead of shooting a net, it would shoot a harpoon with a tether. It would hit this thing and sort of stab into it, and then it would secure it that way. So now I'll talk about sort of what's been done on this problem to date for ADR missions. So there hasn't been an active debris removal mission like a full-on sending a spacecraft up and grabbing a piece of debris we want to bring down. But there has been a few test missions regarding both active debris removal and what's called orbit servicing. So orbit servicing is sort of a closely related thing where you send a robotic spacecraft up to grab onto an active satellite and essentially refuel it or fix some problem it's experiencing to extend its lifespan. It's a bit easier than active debris removal because the spacecraft you're sort of interfacing with is actually cooperative and not sort of tumbling out of control. So I believe DARPA and Boeing did an active debris removal test mission back in the 2000s called Orbital Express, where they fired up two test spacecraft, and one of them they separated, and then one of them with a robot arm kind of approached the other and grabbed onto it, and I think refueled it and possibly changed its batteries. Did a variety of tests, so that was interesting. And then much more recently, there's been an actual commercial mission called MEV-1, where basically there was a satellite that was still working, but it was running very low on fuel, but it was still working, and satellites are expensive. So they sent up this small spacecraft that essentially approached it and grabbed onto it and acts as its sort of new rocket engines so they can extend the life of that spacecraft. And they did that in, I believe, 2020, so very recently, and it was sort of the first actual orbit servicing mission that's been done. Now, for active debris removal, there was a test mission sent up by the University of Surrey and a company called Surrey Satellites, and I believe Northrop Grumman was involved too. But they were essentially testing some of the capture methods we talked about earlier. So they sent up this sort of test spacecraft here, and it had a bunch of stuff on it. It had a camera, and it could release sort of this tumbling target and watch it with a camera and prove that they could they could essentially measure its properties and track a point on that, which is necessary for these missions. They also released a target and tried firing a net at it, which was successful. They got the net to wrap around. And they also sort of released a target on an inflatable boom and then shot a harpoon at it from inside their spacecraft. And there's videos you can find on YouTube of them like shooting this harpoon at this target in space. So it was pretty interesting. This was just after it was released from the ISS. So there's a bunch of companies that have sort of sprung up in the last little while to sort of perform these sorts of services. None of them have fully done it yet, aside from, I suppose, I think it was Northrop Grumman who did MEV-1. But they're all sort of proposing to do active debris removal missions. So there's Altius, which has an active debris removal spacecraft and also sells these things called dog tags that you can put on your satellite to sort of make it easier for a robotic spacecraft to approach it. So hopefully more people adopt that because it would make this problem more solvable. There's also Astroscale, which proposes to do orbit servicing missions and do active debris removal missions. And you see an example from some of their promotional material of their proposed spacecraft approaching a tumbling rocket body here. So sort of an upper stage of a rocket that's just tumbling out of control. And there's other companies that are pursuing this as well. So it's gained some momentum in the last several years. So now we'll talk about how my research fits into all this. So my research concerns debris removal using a robot arm-equipped spacecraft. So that's sort of the most common system that's been proposed for carrying out ADR missions. And what I want to do is I want to give the active debris removal spacecraft, or the chaser spacecraft it's called, autonomy and make it robust to fault. So I want it to be able to sort of make its own decisions. So autonomy and robotics vary sort of smoothly between sort of teleoperation, which is basically fully remote control. There's just somebody, running a joystick and transmitting signals to it to tell it what to do, all the way through sort of high-level supervision up to semi-autonomous control where the thing is making most of its own decisions, all the way to full autonomy. And ideally, we want to get it as far along here as we can get, where the robot deliberates and plans and sets its own goals rather than just acting out preset motions. And the benefit of this is both because it would make the ADR spacecraft more robust to sort of communications faults. So like if it loses contact with the ground, it can still make good decisions and decide whether it should continue to carry out its mission or sort of back off to a safe distance and sort of wait. And it would also reduce the need for ground controllers, so you wouldn't need somebody on site controlling this thing at all times, which hopefully could lower expenses. So satellites and spacecraft, they're not really thought of this way, but satellites are already robots. So we want them to be more capable robots. We want our chaser spacecraft to be a very capable robot that can deal with that can carry out this mission and deal with a lot of possible problems. So this concerns FDIR. So FDIR is fault detection, identification, and recovery. So basically, if something goes wrong, you have to figure out that something has gone wrong, figure out what system has gone wrong, and figure out how to cope. So like if your spacecraft has a broken thruster, you need to realize that something's wrong, that it's because the thruster is broken, and adapt your mission to now be performable with that broken thruster, or reduce the scope of your mission because now you can't accomplish all of it. Same thing with a broken sensor, or any combination of these. And it's difficult because, ideally you could think, we'll just put a new sensor on the satellite to test for this specific fault case, but that sensor can break as well. So you have to sort of differentiate and make a best guess at what's happened. So faults you might run into are things like right here. Here's the Canadarm up on the ISS. It actually got hit by debris recently. You can see it sort of blew a hole in it right through there. And we were lucky because it didn't actually affect its performance. It still works, but if it had hit somewhere else, it could have been damaged and might not be able to do everything it can currently do. So the algorithms I developed for this will be tested in computer simulations of active debris removal missions, but they'll also be tested in a physical test bed, which is basically sort of basically a flat granite slab with little robot spacecraft floating on air bearings on the slab and pushing themselves around with air jets. So basically, you can't simulate full 3D zero gravity on Earth. You really just can't. You can sort of do it in the water, but there's a lot of drag. But another thing you can do is simulate it in 2 dimensions on basically these air-bearing test beds, which are sort of similar to air hockey tables, except that the puck is the one squirting the air out. So here you can see sort of a NASA astronaut riding around on one of these air-bearing test beds, and he's sort of pushing himself around with this air jet because he's sort of training himself how to move using a personal maneuvering unit. So this would be similar to that, except instead of an astronaut, we'd have a robot. So another thing I've done to date is I've looked at doing evasion maneuvers. So originally my research was about planning satellite avoidance maneuvers for debris, and then it turned into doing active debris removal. So part of what I did for that originally was basically implementing this planner to perform these avoidance maneuvers. So here you can see our spacecraft, and there's a piece of debris that it's too close to, and it gets itself away from the debris, and then fires its thrusters to put itself in an orbit that sort of circles the track of the debris so that it won't hit it, and it'll be safe. I also looked at doing a planner controller for steering the chaser spacecraft to rendezvous with the debris. So you can see that sort of depicted here. The debris is this sort of magenta cube. The chaser spacecraft is this blue cube, and it's pushing itself around with these jets, which are depicted as red lines. And it's basically trying to keep itself centered on this green dot, which is attached to the face of this sort of spinning cube, and sort of track it along so that it can sort of keep in station with it and then grab it. Similar to what Mae was showing earlier with the robotic arm trying to grab the UUV. And a lot of my research now concerns machine learning. So I've looked at using genetic algorithms to plan these sort of rendezvous maneuvers. So here you got a tumbling target with a point we have to sort of interface with, and here we got our chaser spacecraft, and it's firing its jets to throw it. So basically, this runs this scenario a whole bunch of times and involves the program that can do the best job at causing this, at maneuvering it in to grab it. And I looked at using LSTMs, which are a type of neural net, to detect anomalies in telemetry. So basically, the whole point of a neural net is that you give it a bunch of data, and it sort of learns to reproduce that data. It sort of learns the patterns in it. So basically, I made this neural net. I gave it a bunch of data of a vehicle operating correctly, and it learns sort of the patterns in the sensor output of that vehicle if it's operating correctly. And then when you're actually doing the real mission, you can continually run that neural net, predict what you should be seeing, and if you see something different, you can say, oh no, that's bad. That's an anomaly. That's probably a fault. Right now, I'm looking at the best way to sort of join machine learning and algorithms called dynamic Bayes nets for performing the fault identification. So Bayes nets are basically a way of reasoning about cause and effect. So basically with a Bayes net, you'd have sort of a node right here, which is effectively sort of a cause, like the thruster has died or something like that. And each of these arrows basically represents sort of the effect it has, sort of the causality joining it to an effect, which might be, the spacecraft doesn't move when you command the thruster to fire, or you get weird sensor readings. So if you set these things up right, you can basically take your sensor readings and work backwards through this to sort of generate what the most likely cause of those sensor readings is. So that's sort of commonly used for FDIR, and I'm sort of working on trying to adapt it now. And then we've also done some work on the test bed. Our lab engineers have been busy working on this, so you can see this here. This is sort of the robotic spacecraft, and it's got an air tank inside, and it rests on air bearings. We're just testing it on somebody's, I think, bedroom mirror at the moment right now because it's very, very, very flat and smooth. So it floats on this. It rides around. You can sort of push around with your hands, and it's basically frictionless. And it has these little air jets near the bottom here that can squirt to sort of push it around just like a spacecraft. So it's pretty neat. We actually have a video here showing that happening. So you can see it's just sort of drifting on this mirror. And the reason we need the granite slab and not the mirror is because this thing, it's so frictionless, it's very, very sensitive to sort of slight deviations. So you can see it sort of drifting on the mirror because the mirror isn't perfectly flat. But we're sort of pushing it with the jets on the side to try and sort of counteract that. But yeah, it's basically just like an air hockey table. It's like an air hockey table if the puck was a little robot. It can squirt itself around. So that sort of describes sort of a basic overview of my research to date and how it fits into the space debris problem. Any questions? No? All right, we're doing questions at the end, rather.
That was awesome. Thanks, man. It just, yeah, grab Mae's and you can just plug it into mine. Yep. Okay, folks. So we're going to fire up with the last talk, and it's cool. I'm seeing some questions come in on the Slido, so hopefully it should be an interesting chat at the end of the night. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Vince Myers. Vince Myers was born in Moncton, New Brunswick, with the sun in his face and the beach sand between his toes. The siren call of underwater acoustics research brought him to La Spezia, Italy, where he worked for the NATO Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation. He returned to Canada with an addiction to image and signal processing, trading science for paychecks as the lead of the Naval Mine Countermeasures Group at DRDC's Atlantic Research Center in Halifax. Now, as the head of DRDC's Maritime Decision Support Section, he supports the development of advanced capabilities for the Canadian Armed Forces in the areas of information and decision science. He holds a BSc in computer science from the University of Moncton, an MSc from McGill, and a PhD from ENSTA Bretagne in Brest, France. His research interests include high-frequency sonar, autonomy for robotics, and machine learning. A neat fact, he will fight anyone who says sonar image resolution is all hype. So folks, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vince Myers.
Hi, everyone. So tonight I'm going to talk about DRDC's contribution to the search for Franklin's Lost Expedition. I work for DRDC with Warren. In 2014, I was in a research team with Mae Seto and Warren. It's great to have the band back together. I say we a lot during his presentation because we had a whole team of people up there, including the guy at the bar over there, Sean Spears, who was my cabin mate during this adventure that we had. So shout out to that. Okay, so in 2014, oh, before I start, by the way, this is like a bit stale. It might be because it's 2014. It's 6-7 years ago. But we, when I was preparing this, I realized we've never presented this publicly before. So it's really, except for a few pictures here and there, the first time we'll be talking about this. So it's kind of fun for me. So I'm honored to be here to tell you all about it. So in 2014, the DRDC Atlantic Research Center supported the RCN with Parks Canada. So Parks Canada was a lead agency for this search here, as well as a number of other government departments and private organizations for the search for Franklin's lost ships, which was the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus, which you might have all heard about. Here's just a picture from the Arctic. So first of all, I don't know if you know, but they found them. So I just want to tell you now, this happened already. So yeah, you already know the ending. All right, so what was Sir John Franklin's last expedition? So the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus set sail from England in 1845 with a crew of 24 officers and 110 men to find the Northwest Passage. So they wintered, we know this, in 1845-46 on a place called Beechey Island. And then the Terror and Erebus became trapped in the ice off of King William Island and probably, although now that's debatable, never sailed again. So disease, poisoned food, starvation likely killed everyone. There were rumors from people and evidence that strongly showed that the people resorted to cannibalism, which was obviously in Victorian England scandalous that that would happen. So it was a really a tragedy in that sense. And so there were numerous expeditions to find the Franklin ships that led basically to mapping a lot of Canada's Arctic northern Canadian Arctic. I guess fact is that more people died looking for the Franklin expedition than died during the Franklin expedition. So there was a lot of, the Royal Navy kept sending expeditions and explorations. It became kind of a prize to try to find this. So here's the Terror and the Erebus. This is a drawing of the ships leaving London in, when they left. And so you can see what we were looking for here. So they're sailboats, wooden sailboats with a reinforced hull for ice for what they were supposed to do. Something interesting is that, so you got to imagine 1845 is the start of the Industrial Revolution in England. There's a lot of kind of hype about everything, how great Britain is and doing things. And they had a locomotive engine in one of these ships, actually. So I think it's just cool to think about this kind of steampunky boat going around the Arctic with a locomotive engine, but still sails. Anyway, so this is what we're looking for. We're kind of, the locomotive engine is important because if the ships had broken apart and rotted away in the Arctic, then we'd probably still find that massive locomotive engine. Okay, so for your situation awareness, as we say, this is a map of the territory of Nunavut. All the way up there, we have Canadian Forces Station Alert. And all the way down here is the territorial capital of Iqaluit, which for us is a super northern place. But if you look at this, it's a very southern place for the people of Nunavut. And so this is Beachy Island here. This is called Devon Island. And so it's a little island off of this big island. This is the town or the community of Resolute. So Resolute is important because that's where we picked up the ship. And Resolute has a Natural Resources Canada runs a station up there called Polar Shelf, which a lot of people doing Arctic research will go and stage and then kind of go out into the more on the ice shelf up there to do some research. It's a great facility. And down here is called the Victoria Strait. And this island here is called King William Island. So this is where we focused our effort. So what happened? So what were the clues that we had going into this? Well, there was one of the expeditions that went to look for the Franklin expedition was led by this Captain McClintock. And in 1857, he found a letter on King William Island. And here's a replica of the letter here. So what the Royal Navy used to do is build these big stone cairns. They were like tall, and they would put messages in it so that future people looking for them would could find these. And you can see it's written in all kinds of languages here. Whoever finds this paper is requested to forward it to the Admiralty in London. And so they would leave messages, I guess, behind for people to send back. So McClintock finds this letter where there's two parts to it. First is the main part here, which is written in 28th of May of 1847. It's kind of cheerful in its attitude, saying, we spent the winter at Beachy Island, and now we're caught in ice at this lat and this long after having been, caught in ice in that channel. And it so goes on so forth. Captain Sir John Franklin commanding, and the best part, all well. Everything's going great. Then, afterwards, about a year later, you see they've scribbled around the edge here, where they went back to it, and it's been described as kind of a bit frantic writing about how they've decided that Sir John Franklin is now dead, and they've decided to abandon the ships and try to make it to a place called Back River, where there was a trading post by the Hudson Bay Company at the time. And so if you analyze the kind of writing on the side, this is where people thought at the time that people had been suffering from lead poisoning and were kind of going a bit mad. Either way, they decided to do an overland trek over the island, abandoning the ships at the point here. So this is where we started from. And so there you go. There was Inuit testimony that suggested that one of the ships had broken up in the ice and sank in the deep water in the north, and the second ship floated south into shallower seas near two spits of lands that looked like fingers. So there were stories that some of the local Inuit hunters had gone on board the ships at the time and taken a bunch of stuff off before they sank. So these were some of the clues that we had. Not a lot to go on. So here's the map again. So there's Beachy Island. So this is according to John Geiger, the possible path that the Franklin expedition took. Goes down here. This is where they wintered, went around here possibly, then down to this island. And this is the abandonment point there. And here, just for your information, how does that work? That's the Back River. So they were going to kind of travel over this island and try to get to there. Got it? And then the red line is what we did. So came down from Halifax, traveled up here, picked up some people in Resolute, and then went bombing around down there. So what was the expedition? It was a public-private partnership led by Parks Canada. Parks Canada are the underwater archaeologists and authorities and all things related to this. But it also had partners, so the Navy, the Coast Guard, us, the Geographic Society, One Ocean Expeditions, which is a BC company that typically organizes adventure tours in the Arctic. And so they were the ones that organized our vessel. The Arctic Research Foundation, the Garfield Weston Foundation Shell, and the government of Nunavut. Okay, I'm going to talk a lot about sonar today, so I thought I'd give you a really quick overview of what sonar is. So sonar is what we use underwater to be able to map, because electromagnetic light attenuates severely in water, and especially salt water. And you can confirm this by going for a swim and opening your eyes. So it's kind of intuitive, I guess, but if you've ever gone, especially down south where it's very clear, if you can dive down 5, 10 meters, everything looks blue because all the other wavelengths have been absorbed by the water, and all there's left is the blue. After 30, 40 meters, you don't really see much. So you need to use sound. So sound travels very well underwater, fortunately for us. And so this is one of the ways we use to map. So a side scan sonar is basically a little kind of vessel like this, which has 2 sensors strapped on each side. And if you work in the marine industry in Halifax and you know all about sonar, this is just one type of sonar. There's a number of different types of sonars. They point all kinds of different directions and do all kinds of different things. This is the one that creates an image of the seafloor. So here you go, a little picture of how it looks like here. Here's a ping, here's a previous ping, and here's another ping. So this is an active sonar. Active means it pings. It doesn't just listen. It sends out sound and waits for the echoes to come back. And so it creates an image of the seafloor down here by listening for the returns. And you can see the geometry here. It really looks straight down and all the way to the side. And it just clears a swath out of seafloor, creating an image. So one of the things with the side scan sonar typically is you need a vessel to carry it. So here it tows down with this cable here, which is a real pain to manage. Actually, the cable here, I put a little, because I knew Mae was going to be here tonight, so she worked on this, modeling the shape of that cable and the drag on it. It's challenging to do deep tows from vessels. And so there you go. This is what a side scan sonar is. Let me just show you some pictures just so you kind of have a little bit of intuition for how this works. This is a side scan sonar of, or an image from some sand ripples. So if you've been to the beach, you know what this looks like. They look like sand ripples. This is where the vehicle came up in the middle here, and it's sending out sound on each side. This black area here is related to the altitude. The sound has to travel first through the water, and then it starts to pick up pictures, or makes pictures of the seafloor as it moves along. So that's a sand ripple. This is a dredge material dump site. I'm not sure where. I think it's somewhere in Nova Scotia, where they've picked up some material from a harbor and then came in and dumped it somewhere else because they were dredging, and you can see how that dump site kind of looks here. Here's some bedrock from St. Margaret's Bay. So it's a bit confusing. It's not an aerial image. There is some kind of confusing processing that your mind does. This is a shipwreck. Hopefully you can see that, that is laying on its side. But because of the way the geometry works, you kind of get this confusing perspective. This is actually the Empress of Ireland, which sank in the mouth of the St. Lawrence. Fun fact, the side scan sonar was invented by a German scientist who came to the US under Operation Paperclip, if you remember that from your history books. Okay, what's a synthetic aperture sonar? We just heard about some synthetic aperture radar satellites, NVSat, RadarSat that Ed talked about. Well, what we have mounted here on our vehicle, which you'll see, is a synthetic aperture sonar. So what's that? Just a real quick refresher on antenna theory. The resolution of an image is determined by the length of the aperture used to create it. So let's say this is aperture just means antenna. So how big is the antenna relates to how big your, or how fine your resolution is. So I have a real aperture we call here of a sonar. We mounted on this vehicle here, which we'll talk about in a sec. You can see the resolution getting worse, right? So the resolution is basically this distance gets worse and worse and worse and worse as you go down in range. What can we do? Well, we can make a bigger array. You can't really do that. You know, we could keep making a bigger array here until you get to the end, but you'll run out of space eventually, and it would be so expensive to make. So just like in space, it's basically the underwater equivalent of a SAR satellite. What we do is we synthesize or fake a longer array by moving the platform and then taking all of these all this data and processing them together as if it came from one long array. That's how a SAR satellite works, and it's really only possible due to the advances in computing that we've had in the past 10, 15 years that allow us to figure out the motion of the vehicle and compute that out, which is very computationally intense, but we can do it now. So the other thing is that it moves. You got to move slow. You can't move too far because you got to make sure that you've got no holes in this array here. So you got to move pretty slow, which, as Mae said in her presentation, is great for underwater vehicles because 3 knots is screaming fast for an underwater vehicle. And so here we go. So what does that look like? Well, it creates a picture like this. The presentation last week by by the guy from Kraken, Dave Shea, I couldn't think of his name, by Dave, talked a little bit about this. This sonar we use is manufactured by that company. So here you go. So this is a real aperture image of an area of seabed, and this is a synthetic aperture image. So it really increases the resolution dramatically depending on the area. So this is the one that we use. It's called Aquapix. It was developed with us and Kraken sonar systems and designed for shallow water naval mine hunting. And so when the parks people showed up and said, hey, we heard you got this really great sonar, we were happy to go help. And that's how it came up. It's got a range of 250 meters on each side, so you got a bit of a half-kilometer swath, just mowing the lawn like a Zamboni, trying to find these ships. It has a resolution of 3 by 3 centimeters, which is constant. I guess I forgot to mention that. That's the beauty of a synthetic aperture image, is that the resolution doesn't degrade with range. It stays the same. And that's key. It's easy to get resolution in one dimension. It's really hard to get it in that other dimension. Okay, so this is the Arctic Explorer AUV that we have that we were using for this adventure. This was manufactured by a company called ISC, who's from I guess Vancouver. And so this is I believe 7-meter long vehicle that weighs 2.5 tons. And the reason we had these, this is over-engineered for carrying a synthetic aperture sonar, but the reason we had it was because in 2011, we had partnered with Natural Resources Canada in order to collect data in support of Canada's land claim in the Arctic as part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So this was another, probably something that we could give a whole talk on, that incredible piece of engineering to do that, but this was an underized vehicle at the time. It was used to survey and try to find where the continental shelf lies in the Arctic in support of the land claim. We have different neighbors up there who claim different parts of that seafloor, so it was important for us to be able to prove. You can't just show up to the UN and say, yeah, this is all ours, give it to us. You have to back it up with some data, and so this is what this was for. And that's why we had it. So when that job was over, we were like, well, we got these 2 vehicles. We should use them for something else. And that's what we did. So the One Ocean Voyager was our survey platform. It's this ship right here. It actually had the Investigator, which is that boat right here. So their little surveying thing. Picked it up here in Halifax in 2014 and drove it up. And you can see here we're transferring over to the Laurier. That boat will eventually go on this ship. That ship will go down south, and they will find the wreck. So that's what that little boat is here. It's basically a launch and recovery platform for our vehicle. You can see it here. It is a beast to deploy because it is so big and heavy. So the Royal Geographic Society actually had gotten together with a number of private partners to use the ship. So One Ocean Expeditions, the BC company, actually, you could buy a ticket to come watch this, and it was really strange for us to be among, just people while we were doing our work. It's true though, right? These are, captains of Canadian industry too in this place. There was a number of kind of prominent individuals whose, I guess, they were interested in coming along for this search. So that was something else. All right, so let's see what we're going to do. This is the Victoria Straits. This is a zoom in on King William Island. So this was the abandonment point according to that letter I showed you earlier. So our job that Parks gave us was to survey this box because the direction of the ice flow was kind of generally this way. And so the idea was that we would start here and work our way down in case we were convinced that one of the ships had sunk there. And this is about 200 meters in depth, maybe a little less than that. It was very difficult to send a tow body with a little boat. So our vehicle doesn't need any of that. You send it underwater and you wait for it to come back. So this was kind of our idea that we could do. The plan was that we could do this entire thing in seven missions as long as we had the right charge and downloading the data. And then down here was where Parks Canada was going to be with another ship called the Marty Bergman and a couple of Canadian Hydrographic Service launches. I don't know if anybody here works in the marine industry, but you might be terrified at how little soundings there are all around here. So the Arctic is not very well mapped and charted. So Where there are soundings is the only place that you can actually legally go without Lloyd's of London not insuring your ship, which then the captain won't go. They're pretty foolhardy, except for that. But once the insurance says you can't go, then they won't go. So I thought it was a mistake when they gave us this. This was the best map we had in 2014 with very little, you see some of these probably gravimetric surveys here. They're with an airplane. Some of these soundings you can see on the charts, they come from the 19th century with a lead line. So it is not mapped up there, and it is something that is really something to see. We're so used to having nautical charts here that you see everything. Not the case up there. So we also got ice charts. So the Canadian Ice Service sends us or updates daily ice charts. They have these, so they look like this. This is King William Island right here. So we were operating in here. This is from the 1st of September when we were supposed to be surveying. The blue is open water. We expected all of this to be open water. It's normally open water this time of year. It was a freak year. It didn't thaw out. And so you get these are called, I don't know, they call them, the guys in the Navy call them egg scores. I have no idea what they mean. I think you need to be a witch to read these. But either way, they're very, you can tell that we are not able to go there because we needed open water to be able to deploy and recover our vehicle. So that kind of threw a wrench in a lot of what we were going to do. You can just see what ice looks like. This is kind of a typical ice day up there. This is just a picture from the ship's radar. It is not good. I actually have a little fun. I just like showing this. Where's my? Oh, here we go. Let's see if that works. Nope. Let's see if this one works. I think I should have copied it. Anyway, this is a time-lapse video of this ship cramming through that ice. We're trying to get to this open ice over here that you can't really, you kind of make out. Anyway, we're trying to go there to deploy, and we're running through this ice. I just find it fun to show how, and it makes so much noise while you're up there. Okay, so how do we deploy? We have a C-can here, just a standard one that we took the roof off and were able to take it out from the top and put it into the overboard here so it could do its mission. And then we picked it up again and put it back in. This was a challenging crane operator. You need a pretty decent guy. The guy on the ship was really good. But this is how we did it. So we did a total of 6 missions during that thing, and I'll show you a little bit about them. So there's where they were. So as I showed you before, in the north, it was all icy, so we had to come down south a little more where there was some more open water. So this is King William Island here. And then these are some of the islands around there, and we did some missions here and some missions there, and I'll show you some data from there, just for your knowledge. So this is the deployment and recovery. This is the most dangerous and the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process, is putting this in the water. As you can see, this is why it's so important, the research you saw earlier that Mae Seto and her group are working on, that this is unbelievably nerve-wracking when you have millions of dollars of equipment here being deployed off of a ship and swinging around and trying to pick it back up. It drives your day. Even just a slight threat of weather in the future coming in that makes people kind of want to recover. So this is the launch and recovery system from the ship's crane. This was a film crew that was there, but these are our guys on a boat here, just making sure everything's okay. And the ice is moving. So you think you're deploying and you think it's all fine. It's something that you'd forget, that the ice is going to come at you. So if this vehicle got stuck under the ice, we wouldn't have been able to get it. It was it. That was the end. We had no real way of getting it back at the time. I'm sure we would have figured something out. Sean over there probably already thinking of some ideas. But at the time, we really didn't know. So here, in this case, this was a pretty challenging situation. We have our boat here. Actually, the AUV is right there. It just came up because we called it up because of the vehicle was coming. Here's the guy in the boat, probably sweating pretty bad. And then there's that ice sheet coming, terrifying for the guys. Okay, let's look at some underwater images from up there. So what you're seeing here, this is about 100, maybe 200 meter wide, just for your kind of scale. 200 meters by probably 150 meters here. So what these are, we think, are methane gas seeps. So you can see what they look like. It's kind of interesting. Just by the way, in the Arctic, there's nothing. There's nothing in the seafloor. It is mud and it is featureless. So whenever you saw literally anything, it was a super interesting day because you spent hours looking at nothing. This is an iceberg scour. So you see when I have a better one coming up, but this is where an iceberg has created a huge scour and moved all of that sediment over. So you see it's just impressive the scale of these scours. This is, I don't know what this is. So if anybody here is a geologist of some kind or understands marine sediment, I have no idea why there's a big round patch of lower reflectivity here. Don't know, but obviously it's going to come out to your eye when you look at the process of the image. Here's another big iceberg scour. I don't know what this is either. This is just looks like a little kind of track of things going down. I don't know what created that. It could have been somebody on the ship thought it was maybe when the icebergs melt, they drop salt down into these big chunks, which could be that, but it looks a little on purpose for my liking. Here's another one, so less polished images. These are really, I have never shown these before, so they're just kind of, you still see the stitching between the tiles here. But anyway, you see a long iceberg scour there. This is an internal wave. So this was an interesting phenomenon that we don't capture very often. So it is a wave on the surface that then pushes itself underneath the water and changes basically it's got a different salinity or temperature from the surface, and and so it's got a different kind of sound profile than the water surrounding it. So it creates kind of this focusing effect, which is the light part here, followed by a defocusing effect, which is the dark one there. So these are just waves traveling below the surface, and we managed to image them, which is pretty interesting. This is just a false alarm, but again, when you're looking at nothing all day, you thought, hey, doesn't that kind of look like a sailboat underneath? It was not. It was literally just the way the seabed kind of came up like that. Here's another iceberg scour. Here's a thing. So it was amazing to have. No, but it's true. Here's actually an object, right? And you can tell here, if you're familiar with these types of images, that it is projecting a shadow of actually pretty high. This is a pretty tall thing that is pointing, because this is the shadow that it projects. We didn't have divers with us at the time, and I think it was pretty deep when we found this. But it's just literally there's not a lot up there, so we thought this might have been an interesting find. All right. So to wrap this up, we had a lot of good press, which was fun. This is from they had a Star reporter on Wilfrid Laurier that was kind of covering this. We had some good things. I just want to highlight this headline here about autonomous underwater vehicles could be Canada's future in the Arctic. We haven't done much since then, I don't think, but we have been slowly. It is a very, very challenging environment to work in. So, what's happened since 2014? Epilogue. So the wrecks were found, like I said. In 2014, using a towed side scan from the RV Investigator, Parks found the crushed wreck of the HMS Erebus in the southern search zone, which is where they were looking, in an area previously identified by the Inuit. They had been searching, so this is important. I got a shout out to, this is Ryan Harris, who's the lead archaeologist for this. He's an all-around super guy. This is during the announcement with former Prime Minister Stephen Harper here when they did that. They'd been searching since 2008 for this round, spending all of their summers in the Arctic looking for this. So it was so great that they were able to kind of have some success on there. And then in 2016, a team from the Arctic Research Foundation on the Marty Bergman found the wreck of the HMS Terror based on knowledge of a local Inuit hunter, and he's also a Canadian ranger, Sammy Kogvik. He was on the Marty Bergman and said, hey, I kind of know where this is. So they went and got it. And so then the last dive, so here Parks Canada has been going on dives every year, every summer, kind of collecting artifacts and documenting everything. The last dive was in 2019 for obvious reasons. This is the famous side scan image that Ryan Harris and his crew there got from the Investigator. This is the Erebus as it was in the bay. You can see it's kind of disintegrated, but still see really, you can see the deck planks here. The resolution is not to my liking, but it's still a nice image. So just so you know where they actually were, so here's where we were looking that summer. So this is where the Erebus was found. So it's in this area here. So by the way, these are National Historic Sites now of Canada. They've been transferred over from the British government. And so it is, I believe, the superintendent of Nunavut has put an exclusion zone of kind of roughly these, I just kind of sketched this out in PowerPoint, but kind of close to that, these boxes where it's illegal for you to go in there. So they're trying to protect the sites from people going in and grabbing stuff out of them, right? So these are the exclusion orders, so you can kind of guess that they were in there. So that's where the Erebus was, that's in 2014. This is where the Terror was found in 2016 by that other team. The name of that bay is Terror Bay. So why didn't we look there? So it's interesting. It's interesting why we didn't look there. So what's really key about this, what really was the key to this search was the oral history from the Inuit that lived there, who, you know, there was Sammy who said, it's right there, and the other one was that there's this gentleman here, Louis Kamakak, who died in 2018, who was just an amazing person who was helping the Parks Canada people look for the wrecks. He had a lot of that oral history passed down from the time of the Franklin expedition that just kept getting passed down and kind of ignored somewhat because of the stories of cannibalism kind of shocked people and stuff. But they seemed to know where it was. So the reason they were looking down south for the Erebus was because Louis was saying, well, we think it's in this area based on our oral history. And it turns out he was right. So, I mean, I guess we know this. We know this even doing mine hunting, that you can't survey. The oceans aren't transparent. It takes so long to survey an area that you need someone to point to where, roughly where things are, because it is so time consuming, especially in the Arctic, but even in non-ice covered waters and kind of more southern climates, it still takes forever to search and find things underwater. And I know this because I'm from Moncton, and I have gone to the beach and thrown a Frisbee in the ocean, and I've never found that Frisbee again. And I'm sure, no, even when you see it land, it's in waist deep water, and you go looking for it, and you will never find that again. So you can imagine what it's like to find something like this. So there you go. This is the bell from the ship, the Erebus, that they pulled up in 2014. They went just weeks after they discovered it, right before the ice closed in, and they recovered the bell. There's an exposition on this at the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. I don't know if the display is still there, but it was earlier. It was really well done. You can see this bell. You can see the sonar images. You can see all of that. And that's my talk.
Hey folks, so that actually finishes up the talks for this evening, but we're still going to do that question period. We're running a tiny bit late this evening, so if you have somewhere you got to be, by all means. We're going to take about 5 minutes though, set up some chairs. There's a bunch of Slido questions there, and we'll kick it off from there, okay?
artifacts in some ways, just kind of smaller.
Cool. All right, folks. So there was a bunch of Slido questions that were kicked up, and what I'm really going to do is we'll just walk through. I'm going to try and hit on a few different ones and see what we get going for a bit of discussion here. The first one I think is related to your talk, Mae. What do you think is one of the most important enabling technologies, sort of in the near term, that's going to improve maritime robotics?
Well, I mentioned the processors. So if you're talking about technologies, so transformational technologies are processors and energy.
Yeah, energy.
So-
I mean, I think
So there's a company out west that's working on a fuel cell that will go into an AUV. That will change everything.
Yeah, I mean that kind of leads to your discussion about persistence,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So, what about like in a space environment? I mean, most things are right now are solar powered, right? But I mean, based on your harpooning satellite, you're probably going to need a fair bit of energy density for that.
I imagine for the harpoon, you'd probably have like a chemical power source.
Okay.
So you'd have like a little like shell or a gun or something, or it would use like a compressed gas. Yeah.
So this is one I think that's going to hit on a few of us here. What is the prevalent methods used for navigation, especially for underwater vehicles? So this is an area I think a bunch of us have done some work in. But you go ahead and start, Mae.
Well, there's the traditional method using INSs, inertial navigation systems, that are aided by a variety of different methods. So Doppler velocity, we're working on terrain-based navigation. So if you're talking technology, it would be something like that.
I guess it may not be clear to people that you have no GPS underwater.
Yeah, like if you stick your head
Put
underwater,
that on
there's no
the table,
GPS.
It doesn't work. So you need your own kind of roll your own solution there for navigation, and so that's why we've been working on these inertial methods and these aided methods for navigation forever, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so one of the things that Mae mentioned is something that's called terrain-based navigation. And the idea, we do it all the time, right? When we're walking around a city, you find landmarks, right? And then when you're lost, I don't know, maybe that's just me, I always get lost in places, but you can recite those landmarks again, right? And it gives you an idea where you are, right? Well, we can kind of do the same thing underwater with sonars, right? The cool trick, when you look at some of the stuff that Vince has worked on with SAS, is normally what you need to be able to do sort of terrain-based or landmark navigation is landmarks, right? But the problem with the ocean is, as Vince pointed out, once you actually get away from a lot of stuff, not much is going on. So it's really hard to do that navigation. But some of the sonar work that Vince works with, something called synthetic aperture sonar, they're figuring out ways to almost use the pattern that comes off the seafloor, even though there's nothing there, but just that pattern itself to be able to use for navigation, right? It's really slick. And then
yeah,
some.
I guess it's just to say that I showed those pictures and it looks like noise, right? It looks like it's called speckle pattern. It follows a known distribution, but it is not noise. It is actually the signal. You go over it at the same time, you will get that pattern again. We use it in synthetic aperture radar to change detections of what's called coherence, and it's the same math on that. But we had to work that out with synthetic aperture sonar because that's why we don't have the space guys. I'm pointing at you like you're a sergeant, but I need somebody. The space guys have this because they have gravity for a motor, and they have just perfect navigation up in space. There's not very little there's no turbulence or anything like that. Whereas underwater, vehicles pitching and moving, and to make those pictures, you need to know where the shape of that array, because you need to compensate for it so that it looks straight. And we figured out these little methods to do that navigation and make that, which is why we've only been doing it recently, as opposed to in space where they've been doing it since the 70s and even before that.
So this one I particularly like just because the term. Can you put a laser broom in space?
You probably could, yeah. You need a power source for it. It depends on kind of the size of debris you'd want to deorbit. So I think a laser broom is best suited to sort of really little sort of small pieces that you can kind of target and just push them with. Basically, it's supposed to heat up one side of the thing and get it to ablate a little gas. so it pushes it down, but it's not a very heavy, a very strong force unless you have a really big laser. So it kind of depends on what size of debris you'd want to use. And I think power would probably be your problem for a space-based system.
Admittedly, this is my term of the week now, right? This is up there with death ray.
Laser broom? Yeah.
Yeah, you know. So regarding space debris, if a harpoon's fired at debris, and then sent their, sorry, I'm just reading this question here. Okay, if a harpoon is fired at debris, isn't there just a big possibility that you're just going to create a whole bunch more debris, and then how are you actually going to mitigate that problem? So,
Yes, there is a possibility. It's a controversial choice.
So here's a SAS question for you, Vince. How does the resolution of a synthetic aperture sonar not change with respect to depth? Do you have to go slower or take more images?
So it doesn't change as a function of range, not with depth.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change with depth either. I mean, the resolution is fixed. So you can imagine we're keeping the resolution the same by using less array. So at the beginning we use just one array, and then after a certain while you run out of real estate on that array, and I use two pings, and then I run out of resolution, and then I use 3 pings, and then I keep running. So you just keep adding more pings in there to keep the resolution constant. So there's no magic in it.
What does a genetic algorithm mean? Asking for a friend. I love this. It's anonymous, right? But so I mean, you can go ahead if you want. That's your work.
So basically, a genetic algorithm is a type of machine learning. So machine learning in general, it just means that you sort of adapt the parameters of your program based on supplied data. It sort of learns. You're not coding everything in yourself. So the idea with a genetic algorithm is that you basically have sort of a program, and you have a way to kind of mix 2 programs together, sort of swap pieces from one with another, and basically have them reproduce the way that genetic organisms do. And then you sort of test them against your problem. Whichever one works best, you let that one survive to the next generation. So it's essentially sort of survival of the fittest for computer programs. You sort of evolve the best solution.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of machine learning, and a few of us have backgrounds in machine learning here, is really about optimization, right? Yeah. It's about finding the pattern in some information that most matches your expectation, and that's why sometimes machine learning can go very, very wrong, too, right? Because if you're expecting garbage, then it'll give you garbage quite nicely. The drones for scouting ice conditions were helicopter-based. Is there a benefit over a fixed-wing aircraft? They would have thought that a plane would be much more efficient in that case.
Depends what speed you want to look at it. You're doing your survey at. So if you're doing very low speeds, fixed wings sometimes can't develop enough lift and stay aloft. So if you want to go very slow, hovery type speeds, then you would use a rotary wing vehicle to survey it. So that's a trade-off. Are you chasing something quickly, or are you going to are you trying to get very high resolution images at a slower rate?
So one of the questions here is there marine life that far north? Does marine life show up in the images?
Oh. Yeah, there is marine life up there. I'm not a marine biologist, but there definitely is.
Well, you get otters underwater. They come up through the holes in the ice.
Yeah. There's tons of life up there. It's very cold, but I think that's not a bad thing for life. But they do show up. We have images of fish and sharks and all kinds of things. Whales that you get. Well, I've never seen a whale actually, but I've seen pictures of sharks, and we always are getting big schools of fish that are coming in. They're actually quite common, especially around here. I don't think we've seen some in the Arctic. I can't remember, but we definitely see them all the time.
Yeah, we see otters all the time.
There's a bunch of krill up there, isn't there? I thought, and the whales would come up every year to kind of sort of hunt in those waters.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely we see that.
Do you get the what was it? The false bottom from the fish vertical
from the
migration?
Fish. Yeah.
Up there?
Well, we don't get it because we have a different type of sonar, right?
Yeah.
But yes, it would be essentially that. You can't see anything past it because the fish blocks the sound. Basically, you just see a big cloud of fish. It's actually quite interesting. This is a ball of fish. It's really quite remarkable.
Whenever we used to go up to the Arctic, you'd always see people fishing off the side of the ship.
Yeah. I mean,
right.
Arctic charge, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
marine life up there.
And of course, seals. They will pop up everywhere, and they smell so bad. In the ice camps, we would see seals pop up. So we would have these camps where you have effectively a tent, and then you have a hole in the ice and a vehicle sitting in it. And I've got a picture of one in my talk next week.
Oh, they come up through the hole.
Yeah, they come up through the hole and they just sit there and look at you and they stink up this whole thing. But it's 40 below outside, right? So you name the seal and you live with it, right?
Well, they're looking for oxygen, and they always seem to know where the holes in the ice are. So they're going, they're
So-
tracking oxygen.
One of the questions, I guess, going along with the Arctic theme here is what are the best ways to keep warm in the Arctic, and how could robotics play a role in this?
Eating.
so-
Eating will keep you warm. No, seriously.
Yes.
If you do not eat enough, you will freeze.
I mean, the best way is to stay inside. You know, when you're out in the ice camp, like we would wear 4 or 5 layers of
Yeah.
clothes, and it was ridiculous because it would take you half an hour to get dressed, right?
Or
And
to go to the bathroom.
yeah, and everybody turns into a 4-year-old because you get all dressed up and you're like, I'm ready to go, and then you're like, I gotta pee.
Yeah.
So you know, but the follow on to that is, how could robotics play a role in that?
Keeping you warm, or
Doing the work so you could stay inside.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is kind of the obvious
That's
one.
not a terrible answer, actually. I like that.
But it's challenging, and I've got some images in my talk next week when you work in the Arctic, and a lot of our work has been focused around the Arctic because it's an ideal environment to be using robotics. But everything breaks. Everything breaks. You know, if you're guaranteed it's never going to break, take it to the Arctic, it'll break.
It'll break.
Like I literally was putting a tent up once, and there was a guy, this grizzled old guy who had been in the Arctic for years, and he was telling me to tape something down with electrical tape. So I was like, oh, sure, no problem, you know. And I was new at this, right? So I'm like, and I turned and I was talking to him for a minute, and they looked at me weird, and I went to put it around, and it just shattered. I mean, it just exploded, right? Everything would break. So it's a real challenge to do work up there, but it is such a great example of where robotics is sort of improving our lives, because it allows us to do sort of advanced things up there without putting people at risk or just putting them in that environment. So one of the questions here that I thought was kind of interesting is, do you see a role for robots in protecting the environment?
Oh, completely.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for environmental monitoring, unmanned aerial vehicles are used to do, like I mentioned in my talk, a lot of the sampling, the measurements.
And it's very, I mean, there's a lot of, for very protected areas, especially underwater, hard to monitor the fishing, the illegal dredging or kind of trawling that happens in there. Even knowing that somebody is gone during certain times by doing a survey and then surveying again a week later, you might not be able to keep eyes on that thing all the time, but at least you can see if something's happened, which then can lead you to a better monitoring policy. So I absolutely see that. Doing that. We already do that with the satellites from space, right? Where they monitor
Yeah,
constantly,
from the surface.
from the surface. The problem is
Yeah.
underwater is one of the last places you can hide, as every Colombian drug lord knows.
And that's what the narco subs are
That's
about.
what the narco subs are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's actually been some neat
Oh,
work.
sorry, correct,
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, I was going to say that there's an invasive, lionfish, the sort of very spiny, toxic fish. Yeah, they're an invasive species in the U.S., I believe. There's actually a research group that built a little robot to go and hunt them.
it injects the poison into the.
Yeah, it's like a lionfish Terminator, just kind of swims along there.
That's terrifying.
Because nothing else eats them because they're poisonous, but it doesn't care.
Remind me not to go swimming there, though, if you don't mind.
Invasive species, though.
Yeah, exactly. They're not supposed to be there, so.
Yeah, so.
Yes, so it's okay then. There's also, when you think about environmental protection, there's some great work in using robots to sniff out and track chemicals, right? So oil spills, chemical spills, things like that, which sort of increase the knowledge, but also increase the effectiveness at cleanup crews to be able to sort of capture and recover some of these things. So again, protecting the environment. So there's a ton of different ways, I think, that robotics can play a role in that.
I mean, they're using robots to reseed coral. Right, so like the Great Barrier Reefs are being eroded by a variety of different forces. And they would send robots out there with, I guess, mini coral seeds or something, and they would reseed the coral fields.
So I'll fire at the last question here because I love this one. why can't you just use a robotic vacuum cleaner for space debris that tracks orbit, speed, and position? Teaches itself to clean up space.
Space robot.
Like, well,
Yeah.
I mean, in the general sense, we are trying to build a robot that can sort of go between different orbits and deorbit pieces of debris. And for my research at least, we'll use learning. We can't use specifically a vacuum cleaner because it's already a vacuum up there. So like, there's no air pressure.
That's sort of like a big catcher.
That's a big problem.
Yeah. so no suction cups, no vacuum cleaners, nothing like that. It has to be grabbing or spearing or netting or sticking. You can do glue stuff. I think people suggested sort of glue stick strips that can like stick onto the debris, but no, we can't use anything with fans.
I'm just picturing a big flying glue stick from elementary school, right? Things just sticking to it. Yeah, exactly.
People have suggested a lot of crazy ideas for this problem. There was one proposal to sort of spray out a bunch of icing sugar into the orbit, and it would form this expanding cloud and then like hit all the debris in that orbit and act as sort of a drag force to sort of lower them down. But I'm not sure it wasn't super well thought out because
That's fantastic. Launching tons of icing sugar into low Earth orbit.
yeah, just coating every satellite. The idea was that the impacts would be slight enough that would bring down the small debris, but leave these satellites up there. But it would also like sandblast them with like caramel. So
That's awesome. Well, listen, folks, that was the questions that were submitted. So I want to obviously thank everybody for coming out tonight. Like I said, it's fantastic to see a great group of people come out and listen to the talks. And I also want to take a moment and thank our speakers, Ed, Vince, and Mae, for doing such an incredible job and giving us an idea of what's going on in robotics around here. So. Other than that, thanks so much to the Carlton and the group here, and everybody have a safe night, and hopefully we'll see you out next week. We have 2 more talks. One will be on some of the work that DRDC is doing in underwater robotics, so I'll be giving that talk. And the other one will be Dr. Ricardo Rendon, who's going to talk about Da Vinci and some of the work that they're actually doing in cancer surgery. So I'm genuinely hoping it's not like my kidneys that are going to be on the picture, but I'll recognize them, I'm guarantee. So thank you very much, folks. Have a safe night.